Have you ever wondered what really lurks in the shadows of Washington state? Tonight's account unveils true horror experienced by ordinary people in terrifying places. Details so real, they'll haunt you long after. Every story on Unspoken Fears is grounded in genuine lived experience, with identifying details altered to protect those involved, but the terror and events remain completely authentic and verified. Where and when are you watching? Drop your location and time below, subscribe for more shocking true stories, and let's dive into the nightmare together. My name is Lorenzo, and what I'm about to share from my time at Steilacoom Western State Hospital still makes my skin crawl. Even now, years later, I work the night shift at the abandoned psychiatric facility as a security guard, rotating through buildings that had been sealed off since the early 90s. I figured it would be straightforward work, just walking empty corridors, checking locks, logging my rounds, nothing challenging for someone with my military background. I'd faced worse situations overseas, I thought, but I wasn't prepared for what waited in those decaying walls. When I first accepted the position, I was told the facility had been systematically abandoned over a 5-year period, with the last patients transferred to newer, more modern facilities by 1994. The buildings were left standing but sealed, deemed too expensive to demolish and too historically significant to destroy. They needed security presence mainly for liability purposes, to discourage trespassers and urban explorers. The pay was decent for what amounted to walking around an empty complex all night. I saw it as easy money. The first week passed uneventfully, the usual sounds of old structures settling, wind whistling through broken windows, the occasional animal scurrying through the overgrown grounds surrounding the hospital. I convinced myself I was hearing pipes and the building shifting on its foundation, the kind of sounds any deteriorating structure makes. I felt nothing unusual, nothing worth worrying about. The job paid well for minimal effort. What wasn't to like? I completed my rounds methodically, documented everything in my log, clocked out, and went home. My supervisor, Emmett, had given me basic instructions: check all entry points, walk through each building at least twice per shift, report any signs of unauthorized entry, nothing more. He seemed almost disinterested in the work, like he was counting down days until his own retirement. He mentioned that Jameson, the previous guard, had quit suddenly after just 6 weeks. When I asked why, Emmett became vague, saying only that Jameson felt the job wasn't suited for him, something about the atmosphere of the place making him uncomfortable. I dismissed it as weak character, figured Jameson couldn't handle the solitude. But then the second week arrived, and everything changed. I was walking through Ward C, one of the residential units where patients had lived decades ago, when I heard it, a voice, distant and muffled, echoing from somewhere deep within the building. I stopped, listening intently. The voice stopped too. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I told myself it was wind, maybe an animal trapped somewhere. But my military training kicked in. I knew the difference between natural sounds and something else, something intentional. I increased my patrols, paying closer attention to every noise, every shadow, every potential disturbance. On the third night of that second week, I encountered something I couldn't explain away. I was passing the day room in Ward B when I saw a shadow move across the far wall. A distinct human shape, deliberate and purposeful, not the random flicker of light or the swaying of curtains. This was intentional movement. I turned toward it, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing was there. The room was empty. Dust particles floated in my light beam, undisturbed, untouched. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot, found nothing. But the feeling of being watched intensified. A presence I couldn't quite pinpoint, but absolutely felt. It stayed with me as I continued my rounds. Then came the staff rooms, small offices where doctors and nurses had worked decades ago. I found things that made my blood run cold, personal items scattered across desks and shelves as if someone had just left for lunch. a coffee mug still sitting on a desk, decades old, the liquid inside long since evaporated, leaving a permanent stain, photographs of families in frames, smiling faces frozen in time, employee IDs hanging from hooks, medical charts organized in neat stacks, handwritten notes in margins about patient progress. Nothing had been cleared properly. Nothing had been documented as removed. The facility had simply been abandoned, with everything left behind, like the staff vanished overnight without explanation, without protocol, without farewell. By the third week, the phenomena escalated dramatically. I was hearing voices more frequently, not just one voice, but multiple voices, overlapping, urgent, almost desperate. I could never make out specific words, just the cadence of human speech, the emotional weight behind it, the desperation in their tone. One night, I heard what sounded like someone calling for help from behind the locked basement door, a door I'd never noticed before, despite weeks of walking these corridors. I checked the building blueprints that Nicholas, our maintenance worker, kept in the administrative office. The door wasn't marked on any blueprint. It shouldn't exist according to the official documentation. I confronted Nicholas about it. He went pale. His hands actually trembled slightly. He told me to never go down there, refused to explain why, became defensive when I pressed him. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong, seriously hidden. I approached Emmett, the night supervisor, asking about the basement and that impossible door. He deflected my questions, changed the subject, eventually admitted he'd never been down there either. He told me that Jameson, a former guard who'd quit abruptly months earlier, had mentioned hearing things in the basement, disturbing sounds that didn't match anything he could identify. Jameson had refused to come back, even forfeiting final paychecks and benefits. Emmett warned me to let it go, to stop investigating, told me that some places had histories, best left undisturbed, that curiosity in locations like this was genuinely dangerous, but I was already invested. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. One night, my curiosity overcame my caution. I unlocked that basement door using the master keys Nicholas had reluctantly given me. The hinges screamed as it swung open, a sound like metal protesting the disturbance. Darkness descended into the depths below, thicker than the darkness above, absolutely suffocating in its density. I descended the stairs slowly, carefully, my flashlight revealing concrete walls, water damage, mold growth. The smell was overwhelming, stagnant, and ancient. I reached the bottom, and that's when I saw it. Fresh evidence of habitation, a sleeping bag rolled against one wall, food containers stacked neatly on a shelf, a makeshift camp. Someone or something was living here, recently, impossibly. I heard movement then, something shifting in the corner beyond my light. I spun around, my heart pounding against my ribs. Nothing visible, but I felt the presence intensely malevolent and aware. Then I heard the voice, clear and distinct this time, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but understanding its meaning instinctively through some unexplainable mechanism. It was asking me questions, personal questions, intimate details about my life that no one could know. My mother's maiden name, her family history, a trauma from my childhood I'd never shared with anyone, not therapists, not family. A secret shame I'd buried so deeply I barely acknowledged it existed. The voice knew everything, every detail, every moment, and it was angry, so deeply angry, furious even. I ran, abandoning the basement, abandoning protocol, running up those stairs with pure panic driving me, my legs moving faster than my mind could process. I quit that night, submitted my resignation over the phone without explanation, packed my belongings, and never returned to Steilacoom. I told no one what had happened. I couldn't explain it rationally. I later discovered through research that multiple former staff members reported similar experiences over the decades the facility operated. Voices, shadows, a presence that knew personal details it shouldn't. The hospital never formally investigated these claims. The building remained sealed, and no one seemed interested in explaining what was actually happening there, what was living there, what had always been there. My name is Milo, and I've summited Mount Rainier 4 times before that day in late September. I knew the mountain intimately, or at least I believed I did. I'd trained extensively, studied maps obsessively, and trusted my instincts completely. That overconfidence nearly cost me everything. I was attempting a solo expedition, starting from the Snoqualmie River approach, planning to reach Paradise Ridge before setting camp for the night. The weather forecast showed clear skies, perfect conditions for an experienced climber. I set out around 2 in the afternoon, feeling invincible. The initial climb proceeded smoothly. I was making excellent time, moving faster than my planned schedule. Around 4:30, I noticed a trail branching off from the main route. It appeared well worn, heading in the general direction I needed to go, but cutting significant distance off my planned path. I studied my map. The trail wasn't clearly marked, but it seemed legitimate, just an alternative route that locals might use. The sun was still high enough that I figured I could afford the time savings. I'd reach Paradise Ridge earlier than expected and secure a better camp spot. I made the decision to leave the marked trail and take the shortcut. Within 20 minutes of my decision, the weather changed dramatically. I'm not talking about a gradual cloud cover developing over hours. This was sudden, overwhelming. A wall of fog rolled in from nowhere with terrifying speed. Visibility dropped from several hundred feet to maybe 30 feet in what felt like seconds. Not minutes, seconds. I stopped immediately, recognizing the danger, but the fog was already too thick to backtrack safely. I decided to continue forward carefully, using my compass and elevation markers to navigate. I'd been in fog before. This was manageable with proper technique. But then the strange part began. I walked for what I estimated was 30 minutes, checking my compass constantly, maintaining my heading, watching the elevation numbers on my altimeter. When I should have reached a specific ridge that my map indicated, I saw instead a dead tree, twisted and ancient, split down the middle by lightning, rising from a rocky outcropping. I marked its location mentally and continued. Maybe 10 minutes later, I encountered the exact same dead tree, same configuration, same position relative to the rocks. I must have doubled back somehow, but my compass showed I'd been traveling in a straight line. My altimeter showed consistent elevation gain. How was I back at the same spot? I tried a different direction, compensating for what I assumed was magnetic interference. I walked with increased determination, watching my time carefully. After another 20 minutes, I encountered something that shouldn't have been there. An old camping site, weathered beyond measure, a tent frame made of materials that looked decades old, supplies scattered around. I checked everything, found dated items from 1983, hiking equipment long since abandoned, food containers so old they crumbled when I touched them. The camp showed no signs of recent activity. It was frozen in time. How could a camp from the 80s still be this intact on an active mountain? Surely other hikers would have cleaned it up, removed hazards. That's when I heard the sound. An animal call, something large moving through the fog. But the sound was wrong, completely wrong for this ecosystem. It didn't match any predator native to Washington state. It was something between a roar and a howl, something that made my entire nervous system scream danger. I pressed forward, trying to maintain composure, trying to apply rational mountaineering logic to increasingly irrational circumstances. I encountered another stream crossing, identical to one I'd seen maybe an hour earlier. Same rock formations, same water flow, same everything. I checked my GPS device. The battery was dead despite being fully charged that morning. My compass was spinning erratically. The landscape began feeling deliberately looped, like I was walking through the same terrain over and over with slight variations. I'd find the stream crossing, move past it, walk what felt like a significant distance, then encounter it again, or encounter that dead tree, or find another abandoned camp, this one dated from 1967. Supplies equally preserved, equally impossible. I started timing my walks, trying to establish patterns. I'd walk for exactly 5 minutes in what my compass insisted was a straight line, then turn 90 degrees and walk 5 minutes again, creating a grid pattern. Every path led back to familiar landmarks. Every direction eventually connected me to something I'd already seen. The panic started then. Real, genuine panic. Not fear of the environment, but fear of something fundamentally wrong with the environment itself. The sun was lower now, maybe 6:30 in the evening. The fog hadn't lifted at all. If anything, it was thickening. The temperature was dropping, and I was no closer to Paradise Ridge than I'd been hours ago. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I shouted loudly, hoping other climbers might hear me. My voice seemed absorbed by the fog, traveling maybe 10 feet before disappearing completely. Then something shifted in my perception. I became aware that I wasn't just lost. I was trapped. The mountain was deliberately keeping me in this loop. I know how that sounds, but in that moment, with the evidence accumulating around me, it felt like absolute truth. I began walking with purpose toward the one landmark I'd seen repeatedly. That split dead tree. If the mountain was cycling me through a pattern, maybe that tree was the center point. Maybe if I could understand its significance, I could escape. I reached it after what felt like 30 minutes of directed walking. I examined it carefully, found something carved into the exposed wood, marks that looked intentional. I traced them with my fingers. They formed symbols I didn't recognize. As I stood there, I became aware of a presence. Something in the fog watching me. Not threatening exactly, but aware, observant. I could feel its attention like weight against my skin. I made a decision. I sat down right there by that tree. I stopped fighting, stopped trying to navigate, stopped resisting whatever was happening. I sat in the fog as darkness fell completely. And something shifted. The pressure lifted. The trapped feeling dissolved. I heard the fog beginning to move. Actual wind beginning to dissipate it. When dawn broke, I was still by the tree, but the fog was gone. I could see the entire landscape clearly, and nothing looked right. I was nowhere near where I should have been. I was in a section of the mountain that shouldn't exist according to my maps. Thoroughly disoriented and terrified, I began walking downslope, making my way toward lower elevations where the air was clearer, and my phone eventually got signal. Harrison, a park ranger, found me hours later on a remote trail section. I was severely dehydrated, my clothes were torn, my boots were worn through. I appeared to have been missing for 3 days, though I was absolutely certain I'd only been on the mountain since that afternoon. Only maybe 18 hours at most. Giovanni, a fellow climber I'd spoken with before attempting the summit, later told me he'd warned me about that shortcut trail. He said others had taken it and returned with similar stories of disorientation and missing time. He'd tried to warn me, but I'd dismissed his concerns as superstition. I never did figure out exactly what happened on that mountain. I've never returned to Mount Rainier. I still can't fully explain the lost days or the landscape that shouldn't have been there. But I know with absolute certainty that something on that mountain doesn't want to be understood, and some shortcuts are never worth taking. My name is Carson, and I need to tell you about what happened to me during the graveyard shift at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I was 26 years old when I took the baggage handler position, newly hired, eager to prove myself. The job paid reasonably well for the overnight hours. Most of my coworkers were content with the solitude and minimal supervision that came with working 2 to 4 in the morning. I figured it would be straightforward work. Load and unload luggage from various flights, sort baggage by destination, maintain the carousel systems, nothing complicated or demanding. I was methodical by nature, logical, raised in a strictly rational household where supernatural explanations were dismissed outright. I believed in what I could see and touch and measure. Anything else was simply ignorance masquerading as mystery. The first 3 weeks proceeded exactly as I'd anticipated. The work was repetitive but manageable. My co-workers were friendly enough, though most kept to themselves during the long overnight shifts. I developed a rhythm, becoming efficient at my tasks. I'd watch the baggage carousels spin predictably, load and unload the same destination codes night after night. Sometimes I'd be alone in the baggage claim area for hours at a time, the hum of machinery the only company. It was actually peaceful in a strange way. There was something meditative about the routine. I began enjoying these shifts. The solitude suited me. Then around week 4, I noticed something unusual. A passenger appearing repeatedly at one of the carousels during my shift. Always between 2 and 3 in the morning, always waiting for the same flight number. Northwest Airlines, Flight 427 bound for Spokane. The passenger was a man, probably in his 60s, wearing clothes that seemed slightly out of place. A suit from maybe the 80s or 90s, perfectly pressed but somehow dated. I didn't think much of it initially. People flew at odd hours all the time, but I began noticing this same man every few nights. Always the same flight, always the same carousel, always completely calm and patient. One night, around week 5, the man approached me directly. He asked me to help him with his luggage, which was strange because his bags were already circulating on the carousel. He seemed confused about this, insisting the bags were missing. I walked with him to the carousel and retrieved his bags. They were perfectly ordinary. The tags were correct. The man thanked me and turned to walk toward security. I watched him, and something caught my attention. He never approached the security checkpoint. He simply disappeared into the corridor. I went to investigate, but found nothing. No sign of where he could have gone. The airport corridors were empty at that hour. There were limited exits, and security would have logged anyone passing through their stations. I mentioned the incident to George, a fellow baggage handler who worked the same shifts as me. George listened carefully, and then his expression became strange. He asked me to describe the man exactly. When I did, he became very quiet. He told me I should stop paying attention to that passenger, said it was better not to engage. When I pressed him for explanation, he refused to elaborate, just repeated the warning and walked away. That should have made me leave it alone, but instead it sparked my curiosity. I started researching flight records, trying to find information about Flight 427 from years past. Over the next 3 weeks, the passenger appeared more frequently, sometimes multiple times in a single shift, and each time I saw him, he became slightly more interactive, more present. He'd strike up conversations with me during quiet periods, nothing threatening, just casual remarks about the weather or the state of airline operations. But there was something wrong about the conversations, something about his tone and word choice that felt archaic, like someone speaking from memory of how people used to talk decades ago. I found myself compulsively researching, spending my breaks and days off digging through airline archives and historical records. What I discovered made my hands shake. Flight 427 had crashed 15 years earlier, a regional jet that had attempted an emergency landing at SeaTac. The pilot had miscalculated the approach angle, and the aircraft went down on the runway itself. There were multiple fatalities, including a man named Robert Hendricks, who matched the description of the passenger I'd been seeing. The records showed he was a corporate executive from Spokane. He'd been on that flight in 1994, exactly the date on the luggage tags the phantom passenger carried. I became obsessed. I started arriving early for my shifts, staying late, documenting every appearance of Robert Hendricks, every word he spoke, every interaction. Caden, my supervisor, began noticing my preoccupation. He pulled me aside one evening and warned me that I was becoming distracted, that my work was suffering. I tried to explain what I was experiencing, and he shut me down immediately, told me there was no such passenger, no record of anyone fitting that description ever appearing at SeaTac in recent years. He suggested I take a few days off, that I was clearly stressed, that I was imagining things. But I wasn't imagining anything. The encounters became increasingly strange. Robert Hendricks began demonstrating knowledge of my personal life, my childhood, details I'd never shared with anyone at the airport. He mentioned my mother's name, my childhood address, incidents from my high school years that only family members would know. He'd mention these things casually in conversation, like they were common knowledge, and each time he did, my conviction that I was losing my mind strengthened. I wondered if I was experiencing some kind of psychological break, if the graveyard shift was somehow rewiring my brain, making me susceptible to delusions. I decided to research deeper. I sought out Natalie, who worked in airport administration and had access to historical records. I approached her cautiously, not wanting to sound completely insane. I showed her some of the flight documentation I'd found, told her about my research into Flight 427. She became very still when I mentioned the flight number. She asked me why I was interested in that particular incident. When I told her about seeing the passenger, she didn't dismiss me outright. Instead, she said something that changed everything. She told me that multiple employees over the years had reported similar experiences, seeing passengers from that flight, experiencing unexplainable encounters. The airport administration had a file documenting these incidents dating back to the crash itself. Natalie brought me historical records showing that baggage handlers, security personnel, cleaning crews, and maintenance workers had all reported virtually identical experiences over the 15 years since the crash. They'd seen Robert Hendricks and other passengers from that flight moving through the airport as if the crash had never happened. They experienced missing time, memory gaps, and increasing psychological distress. Most of the affected employees eventually quit. Some had experienced complete mental breakdowns. Natalie said the airport administration didn't publicize this because they feared it would create a liability nightmare. They simply preferred to pretend nothing unusual was happening. The night after Natalie shared this information with me, Robert Hendricks appeared at my carousel during my shift. But he was different, more transparent, more ethereal. He looked directly at me and spoke with intense urgency. He said there were others, passengers, who were confused, disoriented, unable to understand what had happened to them. He said they were trapped in a loop, reliving their final moments endlessly. He asked me if I could help them understand, if I could help them move forward. I felt something break inside me at that moment. A shift in my understanding of reality. I realized I wasn't going crazy. I was experiencing something genuinely inexplicable, something that defied rational explanation. I submitted my resignation the next day. I couldn't continue working those shifts, couldn't continue being a focal point for these manifestations. I moved to a different city, took a different job with normal daytime hours. I still think about Robert Hendricks sometimes, about the other passengers trapped in that eternal airport moment. I wonder if anyone else has taken my position at SeaTac, if they're experiencing the same encounters, if they're slowly spiraling into the same obsessive research that consumed me. I know what I experienced was real. Every logical part of me rebels against that conclusion, but I cannot deny what happened. The airport still operates. The baggage carousels still spin, and somewhere in the early morning hours, Flight 427 is still attempting to land, still crashing, still trapping souls in an endless nightmare. My name is Elliot, and I grew up in the Snoqualmie area, but I didn't truly understand what lived in those waterfalls until I returned home during my college summer break. I was 21 years old, studying environmental science, filled with the kind of youthful curiosity and confidence that comes from education and distance. I thought I knew the forest near my childhood home, had hiked those trails countless times growing up, but I'd never ventured too far off the main paths, never explored the restricted sections that locals warned about. I figured that was just small-town superstition, the kind of cautionary tales parents tell children to keep them from wandering into genuine danger. But when I returned home that June, something drew me toward those forbidden areas. A compulsion I couldn't quite explain. The Snoqualmie Falls area is breathtaking. Cascading water, dropping nearly 300 feet into a gorge surrounded by dense forest. The tourist areas are well maintained, with observation platforms and safety railings. But if you venture beyond the marked trails, you enter a different world, wilder and more primal. I decided to do a comprehensive exploration, telling myself it was for a school project on regional geography and geology. I prepared properly, with maps, a headlamp, water, the kind of preparation that makes you feel safe, even when you're stepping into genuine unknown. I knew the general layout of the area, or thought I did. But the forest has ways of hiding things, of obscuring paths, and creating optical illusions. On my second day of exploration, pushing deeper into the gorge area where few tourists venture, I found it. A chain, massive and ancient, anchored directly into the rock formation itself. The chain was thick, maybe 3 inches in diameter, constructed from iron that had weathered to a dark rust color. It was clearly old, the kind of old that speaks of decades, possibly centuries. The chain descended into the water below, disappearing into the mist and spray. I couldn't see where it ended. The gorge was too deep, the water too turbulent. The chain seemed to be fastened to nothing visible above ground, just anchored directly into solid rock, with metal bolts that looked medieval or older, completely out of place in the modern world. I photographed it extensively, my rational mind immediately working to construct explanations. Maybe it was historical infrastructure from early dam construction efforts. Maybe it was remnants from logging operations in the 1800s. Maybe it was some kind of artistic installation that had weathered and been forgotten. I needed logical explanations because the alternative was too strange, too wrong. I made my way back to town and started asking questions, approaching locals casually about the chain. Their reactions were remarkably consistent. Eyes would widen slightly. Conversations would end abruptly. People would claim not to know what I was talking about, but I could see recognition in their faces, fear even. Finally, I approached Campbell, an elderly neighbor who'd known my family for decades. She was in her late 70s, still sharp mentally. She hesitated when I asked about the chain, clearly wrestling with whether to speak. I told her I was doing research for school, that I needed historical information. She invited me inside her home, made tea, and only then did she begin talking. Her voice was careful, measured, like someone choosing words in a minefield. She told me the chain was connected to a local legend, something the town had been managing for over a century. She said there were 2 contradictory stories. One claimed the chain was there to keep something from leaving the falls, to bind it to the location. The other claimed it was there to keep something from coming up through the water, to prevent something from emerging into the world above. She said the stories conflicted because the town had forgotten the original truth over time. Campbell mentioned an incident in the 1890s, a period when several villagers had gone missing near the falls. The disappearances stopped suddenly, and not long after, the chain appeared. She said there were references in old town records, but the documents had been removed from public archives decades ago. She wouldn't say who had removed them or why, just that there were people in town who preferred this history. Stay buried, she warned me to leave the chain alone, said that curiosity about it had consequences, that other young people over the years had become obsessed with it, and not all of them had come away unscathed. She wouldn't elaborate on what that meant, just gripped my arm firmly and repeated her warning. Despite the warning, I became obsessed. I spent hours in the local library searching through old newspapers on microfiche, digging through town archives, looking for references to the 1890s disappearances. I found fragments, scattered mentions, nothing comprehensive, but enough to confirm Campbell's story. Between 1892 and 1894, 7 people had disappeared without explanation, all last seen near the falls, all presumed dead. No bodies were ever recovered. The disappearances simply stopped. and within months, the chain had appeared. The records seemed deliberately vague, like official documentation that had been edited or sanitized. I returned to the chain multiple times over the following weeks, each visit revealing more details I'd missed before. I found carved markings on the rocks surrounding the anchor points, ancient symbols that didn't match any indigenous artwork I could identify. The carvings were different from modern graffiti, the kind of marks made with stone tools or deliberate effort over extended time. I also found evidence that the chain had been replaced multiple times. I could see where older chains had been attached, the rock bore marks suggesting replacements at roughly 50-year intervals, which meant someone had been maintaining this actively for centuries. The most recent replacement looked like it dated from the 1990s, suggesting ongoing maintenance and commitment to whatever the chain was protecting. One evening, I mentioned my findings to Salome, my childhood best friend who still lived in the area. Her reaction frightened me more than anything else had. She became almost angry, told me to stop researching, stop visiting the falls, said that some mysteries were protected for a reason, that her grandparents had warned her away from the chain, her entire childhood, that there were families in town who knew things and preferred those things stayed hidden. She wouldn't tell me what those things were, but her fear was genuine and contagious. She physically grabbed my shoulders and made me promise to stop investigating. But I couldn't stop. The obsession had taken hold. I needed to understand. I started visiting the chain site at different times of day, different weather conditions, watching how the light played on the metal, how the water's behavior changed. One afternoon in late July, I encountered Jonah, a teenager, maybe 17 or 18, also exploring near the chain. He seemed equally fascinated, equally compelled by its mystery. We talked for hours about theories, about what it might be protecting, what the historical records might be hiding. He told me his grandfather had worked in town administration decades ago and had mentioned the chain in cryptic terms, something about protecting the town from a mistake that couldn't be undone. Jonah had been researching his family history and kept coming back to references to the chain in old journals his grandfather had left behind. Together, we got closer to the chain than I'd ventured before. We wanted to examine the markings more carefully, to photograph them with better detail. As we approached within maybe 15 feet of the anchor point, something changed. The sound of the waterfall seemed to intensify, became almost deafening despite the distance. The mist grew thicker, and most disturbingly, the chain itself moved, not with the water current, not with any rational explanation. It lifted slightly, the metal links seeming to vibrate with deliberate intention. Jonah backed away immediately, said we needed to leave, now. I resisted for a moment, but then I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the water below, visible only for a moment through the mist, I saw a shape, massive and dark, something moving beneath the surface with purpose and intelligence, something that seemed to move against the current. We fled, running back toward the main trails without speaking. I didn't see Jonah again that summer. He apparently left town suddenly. His family told mutual friends he'd decided to visit relatives out of state for the rest of summer break. I doubted that was the truth. I believed something about that encounter had frightened him enough to make him leave. I continued my research from a distance, stopped visiting the falls directly. But I couldn't let go of the mystery. I contacted Natalie, the airport historian from my previous research, and she actually knew about the Snoqualmie situation. She mentioned that similar chains and bindings existed in other locations around Washington state, suggesting a pattern, something or some things that were being deliberately contained by human effort. What I ultimately concluded, based on fragmented records and local testimony, was that the chain was binding something real, something that had been recognized as dangerous long enough ago that the original knowledge had been lost, replaced by contradictory legends. The 17 residents who'd arrived in the area in the early 1800s might have encountered something in the falls, something they recognized as a threat. They'd constructed the chain as a binding mechanism, and when people disappeared, they understood the necessity of maintaining that binding. The chain had been replaced and reinforced across centuries, because whatever its binding remains active, remains aware, remains dangerous. I left that summer with incomplete answers. I didn't return to explore further. I completed my college degree while maintaining a safe distance from the falls. I moved away from the area for my first job after graduation, but I still research sometimes, still pull up old newspaper archives online, still wonder about what's moving in that water beneath the ancient chain. I know what I saw that day near the anchor point. I know it was real and substantial and intelligent, and I understand now why the town maintains its careful silence, why locals refuse to discuss it, why that chain must never, ever be disturbed. My name is Tilly, and I've been driving trucks on Highway 2 for 30 years. I know every mile of that road between Everett and Stevens Pass, like I know the back of my own hands. I've driven it in every season, every weather condition, every time of day. I've logged nearly 4 million miles on that stretch alone. I pride myself on knowing the road, on understanding its moods and its dangers, but there's a section of Highway 2 that I've learned to fear, not because of the weather or the terrain, but because of something else entirely, something I can't quite explain to anyone without sounding delusional. This is the first time I'm telling anyone the complete story of what happened on a night in March that changed how I understand reality. It was around midnight when I picked up the hitchhiker. I was heading west toward Everett after completing a delivery in Spokane, making good time. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. I saw the figure standing beside the road near mile marker 118, somewhere between Index and the mountain pass. The area is remote, dense forest on both sides, minimal services. The kind of place where you don't see many people. The hitchhiker was illuminated by my headlights, standing calmly with thumb extended, dressed in clothes that looked slightly wrong, slightly mismatched, like someone had put an outfit together without fully understanding how modern clothing worked. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. I'm not typically the type to pick up hitchhikers. I've seen too much in 30 years of driving, heard too many stories. But something about the figure seemed desperate. Alone in the middle of nowhere. At midnight seemed particularly vulnerable. I told myself I was being practical, that I had room in my cab, that the next town was miles away. The hitchhiker approached my window before I could change my mind, leaning down to speak through the open passenger window. The face was nondescript, ageless in a way that made it hard to pin down, neither distinctly male nor female, with features that seemed somehow blurred in my memory, as if my brain was refusing to fully register and retain the details. The hitchhiker claimed their car had broken down about 30 miles back. They'd been walking and figured truckers eventually passed. I was skeptical, but I was already committed. I unlocked the passenger door and gestured them inside. The moment they settled into the seat, something felt wrong. The air in my cab seemed different, colder, despite the heating system functioning normally. I pulled back onto the highway without saying anything. The silence stretched uncomfortably between us. I'm used to quiet. I enjoy quiet. But this silence had weight to it, presence. Then the hitchhiker spoke. They asked me how long I'd been driving this route. I told them 30 years, matter of fact. They responded by naming 3 drivers I knew personally. Drivers who'd gone missing on this highway over the past 5 years. I went completely still. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I asked how they knew those names, and the hitchhiker gave a non-answer, something vague about having heard stories, about people talking, but their tone suggested knowledge that went beyond gossip, suggested personal knowledge, intimate knowledge. I pushed further, asked directly if they knew what happened to those drivers. The hitchhiker became silent again, then started asking me questions instead. They asked where I was from originally, If I had family, if I always drove the same route, if I stopped at the same locations regularly, if anyone knew my exact schedule. The questions felt like someone constructing a profile, cataloging information. I found myself answering despite growing discomfort. Something about the hitchhiker's presence made it difficult to refuse. My mouth moved, and words came out, detailing my hometown, my family situation, my regular stops and rest areas, my typical schedule. As I answered, I became increasingly aware that this was intentional, that I was being interviewed, not conversed with. I tried to lighten the mood, made a joke about being interrogated. The hitchhiker didn't laugh or respond to the humor. Instead, they started talking about Highway 2, about the disappearances, about what they described as the consequences of taking the wrong exit. They spoke in vague terms, but with clear meaning, suggesting that certain exits led to situations where drivers didn't continue their journeys, situations where vehicles were never recovered, where families never received closure, situations that simply happened and were accepted by the authorities as unsolved mysteries. When I asked directly what they meant, the hitchhiker seemed disappointed, seemed to expect I would understand more readily. They said something about how some people weren't careful about where they went, about what turns they took, about trusting the wrong people. My fear escalated into genuine panic. I realized I'd made a serious mistake picking up this person. I looked for an exit, scanning the darkness ahead. My speedometer reading showed I was going 75 miles per hour. I needed to slow down, to make a controlled exit. The hitchhikers seemed to sense my intention, seemed to read my mind. They said quietly that I'd be back this way again, that drivers always came back this way, that this highway had a way of pulling you back, that I shouldn't worry about trying to escape now, that I'd have plenty of opportunities later. The way they said it, with absolute certainty, with a tone that suggested they'd seen this pattern repeat countless times, made my skin crawl. I spotted lights ahead, a small town. I took the exit at dangerous speed. The truck wobbled slightly but held. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and told the hitchhiker to get out. They moved to exit without argument, but as they stepped down from the cab, they turned back and looked directly at me. Their face was suddenly clearer, suddenly more defined, more present, and they said something that haunts me still. They said, "You'll be back this way." They always come back, and then they walked away into the darkness between the gas station lights and disappeared. I didn't see them actually leave. I watched the spot where they'd stood, but they simply weren't there anymore. I sat in my truck shaking for probably 20 minutes. Then I called Yusra, my dispatcher. I asked her about the missing drivers, about whether there was any pattern, any connection. Yusra was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked where I was calling from. When I told her, she said she needed to talk to me in person, that it wasn't something to discuss over radio. When I eventually made it back to the office, Yusra pulled me aside privately. She told me she'd worked dispatch for 15 years, and she knew about the disappearances. She said there were official files, that the state police had documented missing persons cases on that highway that didn't fit normal patterns, that some of her other drivers had reported strange encounters. She introduced me to Akira, another long-haul trucker who'd been driving that highway for nearly as long as I had. Akira's story was eerily similar to mine. They'd picked up a hitchhiker years earlier, experienced the same questioning, the same vague threats, the same sensation of being cataloged and assessed. Akira had also forced the hitchhiker to exit, and like me, Akira had never seen them actually leave the vehicle. Akira told me that after that night they'd become hyper-aware of the highway, of patterns, and they'd realized certain sections seemed to pull drivers in, seemed to create circumstances where bad things happened. Akira had started keeping detailed logs of accidents, disappearances, anomalies on that highway, and the data showed clustering specific areas where incidents occurred disproportionately. I continued driving Highway 2 after that incident, but something had changed in me. I became obsessively careful. I never picked up hitchhikers. I varied my route when possible. I never stopped at the same locations regularly. I told myself these precautions were rational response to genuine danger. But I knew I was also following the hitchhiker's warning, understanding on some level that I was being watched, that the highway itself had awareness, that there was intelligence involved in what was happening. I researched the missing drivers' cases on my own time, found newspaper articles, missing persons reports, realized that some of those cases had never been solved, had simply faded into cold case files. I'm still driving. I still traverse Highway 2, but I'm always aware of the watching, always conscious that I'm navigating territory controlled by something I don't understand. I've never seen the hitchhiker again, but sometimes on lonely stretches at night, I feel their presence. And I know that Akira is right, that I'll be back this way, that all of us will keep coming back this way, because that's what the highway demands. That's what feeds it. My name is Henley, and I am a marine biologist with a doctorate from the University of Washington. I specialize in coastal ecosystem dynamics and have published 17 peer-reviewed papers on tide pool biodiversity. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe will sound impossible, will sound like the fabrication of someone who doesn't understand marine biology, but I need you to understand that I'm a scientist trained in observation, documentation, and rational analysis. I don't believe in supernatural explanations. I believe in evidence and data and reproducible results. But the evidence I found at ocean shores in Washington state doesn't fit into any rational framework I possess, and that terrifies me more than any ghost story ever could. I chose the ocean shores tide pool formations, specifically because of their geological uniqueness. The coastal area features a series of rock formations that are geologically distinct from surrounding areas, creating microhabitats unlike anywhere else in Washington state. I'd read preliminary research suggesting the area had unusual biodiversity patterns, and I wanted to conduct a comprehensive ecological survey, document the existing species, establish baseline data, potentially discover species previously unknown to science. I arrived in early June with my research permits, my equipment, my documentation protocols. I'd rented a small cottage in town and planned to spend 6 weeks conducting fieldwork. The first 3 weeks proceeded exactly as planned. I identified 17 species previously undocumented in this specific location, took thousands of photographs, collected samples, ran preliminary analysis. I was pleased with the progress, excited about the potential publication opportunities. The tide pools were remarkable, teeming with life. Every examination revealed new details, new organisms, new ecological relationships. Then on day 22 of my research, I found something that changed everything. I was examining a particularly deep tide pool formation, one that was only accessible during the lowest tides when the ocean pulled back far enough to create a temporary window of access. In a crevice within the rock formation, preserved in what appeared to be amber or some amber-like substance, I found something organic, something that appeared to be a creature. But a creature unlike anything in my taxonomic knowledge. The specimen was maybe 4 inches long, roughly humanoid in structure, but with features that suggested something fundamentally different from human anatomy. The preservation was extraordinary. Every detail visible, every appendage intact. The thing was encased in this translucent golden substance that seemed to have protected it completely. I photographed it obsessively, took measurements, documented its location with GPS coordinates. I was trembling with excitement and confusion in equal measure. I attempted carbon dating using portable equipment. The results were impossible. The specimen showed markers suggesting an age of somewhere between 800 and 1200 years. But the preservation technique, the amber substance, Nothing matched known preservation methods from that historical period. Nothing matched contemporary preservation. Chemistry either. I ran the tests multiple times, got consistent results each time. I took samples of the amber-like substance for laboratory analysis. Every test I performed raised more questions than it answered. The morphology of the creature suggested evolution along a different pathway than terrestrial vertebrates. But the habitat where it was found suggested marine or semi-aquatic origin. I continued my research, but became increasingly obsessed with this specimen, spending more time examining it than I spent on my broader ecological survey. I was in the tide pool area most days, photographing from different angles, taking new measurements, trying to understand what I was looking at. That's when I first noticed the locals watching me. Not overtly, not threateningly, but present, observing my activities. I'd see the same faces in the small town multiple times, always nearby when I returned from the tide pools. Always watching. I told myself I was being paranoid, that small towns are naturally curious about outsiders. But something felt coordinated about their observation. One afternoon, a local woman approached me directly. She was probably in her 80s, moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age. She introduced herself as Margaret and said she needed to talk to me about what I'd found in the tide pools. I asked how she knew what I'd found, and she said the town knew everything that happened in those pools, that certain things were meant to stay hidden. She warned me that previous researchers had made the same discoveries, had become obsessed just as I was, and they had disappeared. She said it not as metaphor, but as literal fact. They had ceased to exist, had stopped coming to ocean shores, and no one had ever seen them again. She told me that some tide pools were not meant to be disturbed, that there were reasons the locals avoided that area, that there were histories the town had collectively decided to bury. I dismissed her warnings as folklore, as the superstitious beliefs of a small coastal community, but I couldn't entirely ignore them. I felt a growing unease, a sense that I was trespassing on something protected, something dangerous. I told myself to document the specimen one final time and then move on with my broader research. But when I returned to the tide pool the next morning, the specimen was gone. Not just removed, but deliberately destroyed. The amber-like substance was shattered, broken into fragments, and whatever had been inside was obliterated. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had specifically targeted this specimen, had known exactly where it was, had deliberately destroyed it. I reported the destruction to local authorities, speaking with Quincy, a park official who oversaw the protected coastal areas. Quincy's response was shocking. They became almost hostile, demanded to know exactly what I'd been photographing, where I'd been accessing, what I'd been collecting. When I tried to explain about the specimen, Quincy cut me off abruptly and told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to leave ocean shores immediately, that my research permits were being revoked, that I should pack my belongings and depart within 24 hours. When I protested, when I asked what I'd done wrong, Quincy said something that will stay with me forever. They said that some discoveries shouldn't be shared, that some knowledge was dangerous, that I should be grateful I was being given the option to leave voluntarily. I decided to research further before leaving. I went to the local historical society and met with Leanna, a local historian who had initially helped me understand the area's geological history. I showed Leanna my photographs of the specimen and asked about previous researchers. Leanna's entire demeanor changed. She became frightened, told me she couldn't help me, that I should forget what I'd seen. When I pressed her, she finally told me about the pattern, about marine researchers and biological specialists who had come to ocean shores over the past 50 years, about their projects, their discoveries, their subsequent disappearances. She showed me files, documentation, newspaper clippings about missing persons, all researchers, all connected to the coastal area, all events that had been quietly closed without resolution. I discovered through Leanna that there was a historical incident in the area, something involving indigenous peoples and early colonial settlement, something that involved the tide pool specifically. But the records had been sealed, the documentation removed from public archives, access restricted. Leanna said that whatever had happened, the town had decided collectively to protect that history, to prevent additional discoveries, to maintain silence. She said there was an understanding among local residents that certain areas were off limits, that curiosity in those locations had consequences. When I asked what those consequences were, she just repeated what Margaret had said, that people disappeared, that they stopped existing, that no one investigated. I left Ocean Shores the next day. I didn't complete my research. I didn't publish my findings. I abandoned 6 weeks of fieldwork and months of preparation. I went back to Seattle and tried to pretend the whole experience had been some kind of professional failure, some misjudgment of location or timing, but I couldn't let it go. I started researching independently, pulling historical records, investigating the indigenous history of the area, discovering fragmentary accounts of something being imprisoned in the coastal formations, something that predated human habitation, something that the original peoples had contained and managed, something that European colonists had disturbed and then recontained. I found academic papers from the 1970s by a researcher named Dr. James Mitchell, a marine biologist who'd conducted work in that exact area and then vanished. While still mid-research, his work was incomplete, his conclusions unclear, but his notes suggested he'd found something that contradicted current understanding of evolutionary history, something that suggested human history was far more complex and far more disturbing than conventional narrative allowed. His research was never published. His disappearance was never formally investigated. His work simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. I realize now that I'm being monitored, that my access to certain information is restricted, that people in positions of authority are aware of my research and are discouraging it. I stopped trying to investigate further about 2 years ago. I accepted that some knowledge is genuinely dangerous, that some truths are meant to stay buried, that certain coastal areas are protected not for ecological reasons, but for reasons that go far deeper into history and into the fundamental nature of what shares this planet with us. I still work as a marine biologist. I publish papers on conventional topics. I maintain my academic career, but I'll never return to Ocean Shores, and I'll never try to understand what was preserved in that amber substance or what the town is so desperately trying to keep hidden. My name is Rosalie, and I'm a freelance photographer specializing in documenting abandoned structures across the American landscape. I've built my career on finding forgotten places, capturing their decay, telling the stories of human habitation through photographs of empty rooms and decaying infrastructure. I've explored hundreds of abandoned buildings over the past 8 years, from factories to hospitals to entire ghost towns. I pride myself on my ability to remain objective, to observe without judgment, to document history without letting emotion interfere with my work. But the logging camp I found deep in the Cascade Mountains changed something fundamental in how I approach my work, changed my understanding of what exploration means, changed whether I believe some places should remain undiscovered. I first heard about the camp through an old Forest Service document I found while researching Snoqualmie National Forest history. The reference was brief, almost dismissive, a logging operation designated as Camp 17 that had apparently ceased operations in 1957. No explanation for closure, no formal decommissioning record, just a name and dates. The location coordinates were vague, deliberately vague, I'd later realize, but I managed to triangulate the approximate location based on topographic maps and Forest Service infrastructure references. I spent 3 weeks planning the expedition, researching the area, preparing supplies. I was excited. This was exactly the kind of discovery that made my work meaningful, a place that had been forgotten by history, waiting to be documented. I hiked into the location in early September, carrying a full pack of photography equipment, camping supplies, enough food for 5 days. The trail was overgrown, barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. I could tell from the terrain that few people had ventured this direction in recent years, possibly decades. The forest was reclaiming the path, and I found myself wondering repeatedly if I was still following the correct route. The coordinates said I was close, but I saw no sign of any camp. Then suddenly the forest opened slightly, and I saw it. Remnants of structures emerging from beneath decades of accumulated pine needles and forest debris. The camp was remarkably preserved, not because it had been maintained, but because it had been abandoned so completely that nature had essentially paused its reclamation, as if something was keeping the forest at bay. I saw 3 main buildings and several outbuildings, all constructed from heavy timber, all showing weathering and decay consistent with 6 decades of abandonment. Equipment was scattered throughout the clearing, rusted machinery, saw blades, chains, the tools and implements of logging work left exactly where workers had apparently abandoned them. I spent hours photographing the exteriors before entering any of the structures, documenting the camp's layout, the arrangement of buildings, the pattern of debris. The first building I entered was clearly a bunkhouse. I could see the remains of bunks lining the walls, fabric from mattresses still clinging to the frames, personal belongings scattered across surfaces, as if the residents had vanished mid-life. Clothes hung on hooks, some of them still maintaining shape despite the decades. I found photographs in frames, family portraits, images of smiling people who'd worked in this remote location, faces frozen in time. I found letters, stacks of correspondence addressed to workers, dated from 1955 to 1957. The handwriting was careful, personal. Letters from families expressing love and concern, asking when the workers would return home. I photographed everything systematically, but my objectivity began wavering as I examined the personal items. The specificity of individual lives disrupted, the intimacy of abandoned belongings making it harder to maintain professional distance. I found a wedding photograph dated 1956. A young couple radiating happiness. I wondered what happened to them, whether they'd ever reunited, whether the person who'd carried this photograph out of the camp in their pocket was still alive, still remembering. I found a child's drawing, crude and colorful, clearly made by a young hand, left behind in a bunkhouse. The child had drawn trees and mountains and stick figures. What happened to that child? Did they grow up wondering what happened to their parent working in this remote camp? I moved to the main administrative building, a larger structure containing office space and what appeared to be a kitchen and dining area. I found the logbooks here, stacked on shelves, years of daily entries documenting operations, worker assignments, supply deliveries, weather conditions. I began reading them chronologically, starting with 1954. The early entries were standard, professional, documenting normal logging operations, efficient productivity, management concerns about efficiency and profit. But as I progressed through 1956, the tone began changing subtly. Entries became less formal, more personal. I noticed mentions of illness among workers, mentions of unusual wildlife behavior, mentions of sounds at night that didn't match known animals. By mid-1956, the entries were becoming erratic, the handwriting deteriorating, the language becoming increasingly fragmented. One entry read, "The sickness is spreading. 3 more men showed symptoms yesterday. We don't have adequate medical supplies. We sent a message down the mountain requesting assistance." Another entry read, "Can't leave camp. The forest won't let us go. Men tried to hike out yesterday morning, came back by evening saying the trails kept looping. They swear they were walking straight, but kept arriving back at the same locations. The final entries were barely legible, written with what appeared to be shaking hands. The last coherent entry, dated October 3rd, 1957, read something in the trees, in the darkness around the camp. Men are barricading themselves in the main lodge. We can hear something outside the buildings at night scratching. Sounds that aren't natural. I think we're going to die here. I think something is keeping us here. The final pages were missing, torn out, leaving only fragments. The last visible marks appeared to be scratch marks, not words, just repeated scoring of paper, as if someone had pressed so hard with their pen that they damaged the pages beneath. I found the barricaded building, impossible to miss once I knew what I was looking for. One of the smaller outbuildings had its interior completely sealed, windows nailed shut from inside with what appeared to be frantic effort, planks hammered across every opening. The nails were rusted but still firmly in place. I couldn't see inside. The barriers were too complete, but I could see evidence of what had been attempted inside. Scratches around the frame, suggesting things being moved, rearranged, desperate configurations of material intended to create barriers. I photographed the exterior obsessively, but I felt no desire to force entry. Felt instead an instinctive warning against disturbing whatever this space contained. The most disturbing discovery was inside the main lodge. The interior walls were covered with markings, carved deliberately into the wood, hundreds upon hundreds of tally marks, vertical lines in groups of 5, covering entire wall sections. I counted systematically, found approximately 3,000 tally marks in the main room alone. What was being counted? What did each mark represent? I found words carved into other surfaces, some in English, but deliberately written backwards or upside down, warnings that became visible only when I held them at angles or photographed them and reviewed the images later. One word carved repeatedly into a support beam read "run," just the single word "run," carved over and over. Another surface bore a phrase, something in the old growth, something that feeds on workers, something that doesn't let them leave. I spent the first night in my tent outside the camp. I couldn't bring myself to sleep inside any of the buildings. Something about the accumulated evidence of catastrophe made interior spaces feel dangerous. I lay awake listening to forest sounds, hearing every creature movement as potential threat. The next day, I continued documenting, photographing the carved warnings, collecting data, but the unease was overwhelming. I found myself working faster, wanting to finish and depart. I discovered that the camp wasn't on any current maps. When I checked my research materials against actual Forest Service maps, the location was blank space. No indication of Camp 17, no documentation of the logging operation. It was as if the place had been deliberately erased from official records. I consulted with Lorenzo, a historian at the University of Washington, who specializes in Pacific Northwest industrial history. I showed him my photographs and documentation. His reaction was immediate and intense. He said he'd heard references to Camp 17 in archival materials, but the files had been sealed, that the Forest Service had records of the camp, but they were restricted. He said something catastrophic had happened there, something that the government had decided to suppress. He warned me against pursuing further investigation, said that some historical suppression served purposes that shouldn't be questioned. I also contacted Emmett, a local who lived near the forest entry points. I asked him directly if he knew anything about the camp. He became very quiet, told me his grandfather had worked there, had been one of the few who'd made it out, had suffered severe psychological trauma, refused to ever discuss what happened. Emmett said his grandfather lived until he was 92, but never voluntarily discussed Camp 17. Only occasionally in nightmares would he reference it, mentioning something about trees and hunger, and things that shouldn't be possible. Emmett told me to leave the camp alone, that some places were abandoned for good reasons, that some history was meant to stay buried. I left my remaining photographs and documentation in secure storage. I stopped pursuing the camp story. I stopped investigating the Forest Service records. I made a conscious decision to move forward without answers. But I think about that place regularly. I think about the workers whose names I found in those photographs and letters. I think about what they experienced in those final days, what forced them to barricade themselves in buildings, what made them carve desperate warnings into wood, what something in the old growth forest was feeding on. I've never returned to the location. I've never attempted to access the camp again. I'm aware that I'm probably being monitored by people who wanted that place to stay forgotten, but I accepted that cost as the price of leaving it undisturbed. Some discoveries should remain unmade. My name is Jonah, and I've been investigating paranormal phenomena for 16 years. I have certifications in paranormal investigation methodology. I've conducted over 200 investigations at allegedly haunted locations across the Pacific Northwest. I've documented evidence at historic sites, battlefields, hospitals, private residences. I've built a reputation for rigorous methodology, for skepticism tempered with openness, for documenting phenomena that resist easy explanation. I pride myself on maintaining scientific approach even when confronting experiences that seem to transcend conventional understanding. But the investigation I conducted at Walla Walla State Penitentiary fundamentally altered my understanding of what paranormal phenomena can be, what intelligence might exist in spaces marked by human suffering. I'm still not sure I've fully processed what happened there. I'm not sure I ever will. I was contracted to conduct a paranormal investigation at the former penitentiary facility by a documentary production company interested in producing content about the prison's most historically violent period. The permission was granted directly by the prison administration. I was allowed access to the most restricted areas, including the old solitary confinement wing and death row sections. I arrived on a Thursday evening in late October with my full equipment array, EMF meters, thermal imaging cameras, audio recording devices, motion sensors, the complete toolkit of professional investigation. I set up base camp in an administrative area and scheduled my initial sweep for that night. The first few hours were standard fare, baseline measurements, ambient environmental conditions, preliminary walks through various sections documenting baseline activity. I found the usual prison haunting material, reports of apparitions in the general population areas, sounds of inmates' voices echoing through empty cell blocks, residual energy signatures consistent with locations of trauma and suffering. Nothing unexpected. Nothing that suggested anything beyond the typical residual hauntings that prisons often produce. I was feeling confident, perhaps overly confident. I'd investigated thousands of hours in haunted locations. I was prepared for whatever manifestations emerged. Around midnight, the activity intensified dramatically. My EMF meter began registering spikes far beyond baseline levels. Thermal imaging showed cold spots appearing and disappearing in specific patterns. Audio recordings picked up sounds that clearly resembled human vocalization, but with quality that suggested non-human origin. I was excited. The activity level was significantly higher than I'd anticipated. I set up more sophisticated recording equipment in the most active areas and began documenting intensively. Then the entities began communicating through my equipment. At first, just emotional impressions, sensations of rage and despair transmitted through the devices, but then they began attempting language, fragmented words and phrases emerging from my audio recordings. The communications escalated in coherence and specificity. The entities seemed to be learning how to interface with my equipment, learning how to form words in English. Their first clear phrase was my name. Not just Jonah, but my full name, Jonah Michael Reeves. I felt a cold shock through my entire body. I hadn't provided any personal information to the prison administration. I'd registered under my investigation company name. My personal details were private. How did these entities know my full name? I demanded to know how they'd obtained that information, and the responses that came through my equipment were chilling. They began detailing my personal history, my mother's maiden name, her exact address from my childhood, a traumatic incident from when I was 7 years old that I'd never disclosed to anyone. The entities described finding me nearly drowning in a quarry pit when I was a child, an incident I'd successfully repressed for decades, an incident that had left me with water phobia I'd never fully explained to anyone. How could entities in a prison hundreds of miles away have knowledge of something so specific, so private, so deeply buried in my personal psychology? The communications became aggressive, almost accusatory. They demanded to know why I was there, what I was investigating. They seemed angry at my presence specifically, not angry at intrusion generally, but angry at me, as individuals, as if they had personal grievance against me specifically. My EMF meter went haywire, registering levels I'd never encountered before. The thermal imaging showed movement throughout the solitary confinement wing, multiple simultaneous apparitions manifesting. Doors throughout the facility began slamming, not gently, not gradually, but violently, with force that suggested immense physical strength. I heard what sounded like running footsteps in the corridors, the sounds of violence, of struggle, of rage manifesting as physical action. I attempted to remain professional, continued documenting, but fear was overwhelming my rational process. I was no longer in investigator mode. I was in survival mode. The entities communicated increasingly specific warnings through my equipment. They warned me repeatedly about the Eastern Wing, the old death row section. They insisted repeatedly that I should not go there, that something in that section should not be disturbed, that something in that section would be released if it was awakened. Their communications became almost pleading, which was strange for entities that had previously been aggressive. They cycled between rage and desperation, between threatening me and warning me. One particular entity seemed to take specific interest in me, seemed to be trying to establish individual communication with me separate from the collective entity presence. This individual entity communicated personal information with terrifying specificity. It told me details about my mother's death 5 years earlier, details that I'd kept private. My mother's exact final words, specific medical information from her hospital records, deeply personal moments between us that only I would know. The entity was demonstrating that it could access my private memories, could somehow read my personal history, could know things about me that shouldn't be knowable. I felt violated on a level I'd never experienced before. I felt like my consciousness was being invaded, my private self exposed to hostile intelligence. Despite my fear, despite every warning from the entities themselves, I felt compelled to move toward the death row section. I know now that I was being manipulated, that the compulsion was being introduced into my consciousness externally. But in the moment, it felt like my own choice. I found myself walking corridors I didn't consciously choose to walk, moving toward restricted areas I had no legitimate reason to enter. I discovered a sealed chamber, a room that hadn't been officially documented in the prison infrastructure records. The door was secured with multiple locks, but as I approached, the locks began opening mechanically, as if responding to my presence. Inside the chamber, I found evidence of something that shouldn't exist in a standard penitentiary facility. I found markings on the walls similar to markings I'd seen in other investigations, markings that seemed to predate the prison facility itself, markings that suggested something had been deliberately imprisoned in this location, contained, bound. The chamber smelled of something ancient and wrong, something that made my body respond with primal fear. I felt a presence in that space, something vast and aware, something that had been waiting, something that acknowledged my intrusion with attention that felt almost hungry. I experienced missing time then. I'm not sure how long I was in that chamber, seconds or hours. I only know that I was in the chamber. And then suddenly I was somewhere else, in a different corridor, without any memory of moving, without any understanding of how I'd transported from one location to another. I forced myself to leave the prison facility immediately, abandoning my equipment, ignoring every professional protocol, just moving toward the exit, with desperation driving my actions. I made it to my vehicle and drove away in the darkness. I didn't look back. I didn't return for my equipment. I simply escaped. I contacted Natalie, a fellow paranormal investigator I'd worked with on previous projects, and told her about my experience. I asked if she'd be willing to return with me to retrieve my equipment and conduct a secondary investigation. Natalie listened to my account and then refused explicitly. She said she'd heard about Walla Walla, had heard warnings from other investigators, had decided years earlier never to investigate that location. She said something was fundamentally different about that facility, that it wasn't a standard haunting, that whatever was there predated the prison, that the prison had been deliberately constructed on a location where something was already imprisoned. She strongly advised me against any further involvement. I spoke with Milo, a prison historian, who confirmed Natalie's suggestion. He told me that Walla Walla State Penitentiary had been built on a location previously used for something else, something the historical records were unclear about. He said the site predated European settlement, that indigenous peoples had some kind of containment operation there, that when the penitentiary was constructed, it had essentially served as a more permanent, more institutional replacement for whatever containment had previously existed. He said the building served dual purpose, imprisoning human criminals and also containing something else, something that predated human civilization. The investigation affected me profoundly. For weeks after, I experienced continued contact with that individual entity, the one that had seemed interested in me specifically. I'd receive messages through various devices, fragmentary communications attempting to establish ongoing connection. I'd experience moments of lost time, periods where I'd lose consciousness and then regain awareness in different locations with no memory of transit. I visited a neurologist, underwent extensive testing. No physical explanation was found. Eventually, the communications became less frequent, but I still experience them occasionally, still receive messages, still feel the presence of that entity watching me, waiting for something. I never returned to Walla Walla to retrieve my equipment. I never conducted a follow-up investigation. I've stopped accepting contracts for paranormal investigation in prison facilities. I've questioned whether I should continue investigating at all. I know now that there are entities and intelligences operating in this world that exist beyond my ability to safely comprehend, that some places are dangerous not because of standard paranormal phenomena, but because of something fundamentally wrong with the location itself, something that transcends normal understanding of haunting or residual energy. I still work as an investigator, but I work with extreme caution, with profound respect for the locations I enter, with full acceptance that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors are meant to remain sealed, and some entities are better left undisturbed. My name is Akira, and I need to tell you about the mistake we made when we decided to leave the city and seek a simpler life in the rural areas outside Bellingham, Washington. I'm 39 years old. I'm a protective parent. I'm observant and rational. I pride myself on noticing details others miss. I've always trusted my instincts about people and situations, but the instincts that have served me well in urban environments failed catastrophically in the isolated backwoods community where we attempted to build a new life. I'm telling this story because I need people to understand that some communities operate with different rules, that isolation can harbor threats that feel impossible to articulate until you're already trapped within them. My spouse and I had been discussing leaving Seattle for years. We wanted our 2 children to experience rural living, to have space to play, to escape what we perceived as the suffocating pressure of city life. We wanted quiet, community, connection to natural environment. We found a property 20 miles outside Bellingham, deep in forest, nearly 10 acres, remote but not impossibly distant from town. It seemed perfect. The price was reasonable, surprisingly reasonable in retrospect. The real estate agent was a woman named Henley, who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the property, about our family, about our plans. She helped us navigate the purchase process smoothly, almost suspiciously smoothly. We closed in late April and moved in by early May. The first month was everything we'd hoped for. The property was beautiful. The nearest neighbors were a mile away. We had privacy and space and silence. Our children loved it immediately. They explored the property, built forts in the forest, learned to identify plants and animals. We felt like we'd made the right decision. The neighbors we met seemed friendly. If somewhat reserved, people nodded hello at a distance. We were welcomed, but not intrusively so. We thought we'd found a community of people who respected privacy, who understood rural values. We were profoundly mistaken. By the second month, I began noticing patterns. Specific neighbors would appear at the edge of our property, at seemingly random times, just standing there, watching the house. When I'd approach them, they'd move away. When I tried to speak with them, they'd become vague, evasive. They'd mention needing to check something on the property line, needing to examine their own land boundaries, but they'd clearly been watching our house, not examining any property feature. I mentioned this to my spouse, suggested it might be normal rural behavior, property owners checking boundaries, but something about the specificity bothered me. It wasn't random. It was patterned, coordinated. The children reported seeing neighbors at their bedroom windows at night, faces pressed against the glass, just watching. My immediate response was to install better curtains, to put locks on their bedroom windows, to increase security. But internally, I was terrified. Why would adults be peering into children's bedroom windows at night? What possible legitimate reason could justify that behavior? I confronted the neighbors directly, asked what they were doing near our property at night. The responses I received were vague, dismissive. One neighbor said he was just checking the forest. Another claimed he'd been lost. Another simply denied it happened. I contacted the local police, reported the incidents. The officer who responded seemed uncomfortable, suggested it was probably innocent, suggested I might be misinterpreting rural customs. Then I began finding items at our property line, gifts left deliberately. At first, benign things, flowers, produce from gardens, simple offerings that seemed friendly, but then items that were clearly from inside our house, items that had been stolen. A child's toy that I'd seen in our house 2 days earlier now left at the property line with a note that read, "We know what you have. Small things stolen, then returned," creating psychological pressure, creating awareness that access to our home was possible, that security was an illusion. I found cryptic notes, handwritten messages that were difficult to parse, suggestions that seemed threatening but remained technically ambiguous. One note read, "The way things work here takes time to understand." Another read, "Your family hasn't decided yet." I attempted to investigate previous residents. I drove through the community, looked up property records, discovered that multiple families had moved away suddenly from properties in the area, some within the last 5 years. Some property transfers showed unusual notations. One description stated, "Property transferred to neighbors." Another simply said, "Family relocated without explanation." I tracked down contact information for previous residents through social media and phone records, attempting to reach them. Most didn't respond. Those who did were evasive. One woman who'd lived in the area years earlier did speak with me. She warned me to leave immediately, said the community operated under different rules, said that isolated families in the area were eventually either driven out or absorbed. She wouldn't elaborate further, said she didn't want to discuss it, just emphasized that leaving quickly was crucial. My fear escalated into paranoia. I began documenting everything, photographing the neighbors when they appeared at our property line, recording times and descriptions. My spouse thought I was overreacting, thought I was letting stress and isolation affect my judgment, but I knew something was organized about the behavior, knew it was coordinated, knew we were being studied or assessed or tested. I reinforced home security, installed motion sensor lights, added locks, attempted to make our property less accessible, but I felt the perimeter of safety contracting around us. One evening, a neighbor named Carson approached our house. Directly, he was the one I'd observed most frequently at our property line. He was probably in his 50s, possessed an unsettling calmness. He knocked on our door politely, introduced himself formally, and asked if we could talk. My instinct was to refuse, but he'd been cordial. He wasn't threatening overtly. I let him inside. We sat in our living room, and he spoke carefully about how things worked in the community. He explained that the area operated as a cohesive unit, that newcomers were evaluated, that families were expected to participate in community structures. He spoke without threat, but with clear implication that participation wasn't optional. He mentioned that previous families had chosen not to engage, had decided to leave, that others had chosen to integrate, to participate, to accept the way things worked. When I asked directly what he meant by the way things worked, Carson became almost gentle. He said some communities required particular commitments, particular understandings, particular sacrifices. He said the property we'd purchased came with obligations we might not have understood when we bought it. He said decisions needed to be made about our family's future in the community. He said choices made now would determine outcomes. He left after approximately 20 minutes, leaving me shaking with fear and confusion. I immediately researched everything I could find about the community, digging through property records, tax documents, historical records. I discovered patterns that chilled me. Properties changed hands frequently within a limited group of families. Economic structures suggested significant wealth concentration among a small group. Historical records showed community resistance to external authority, to law enforcement investigation, to oversight. I found references to community organizations and activities that were conducted privately, information about community gatherings that weren't advertised, about decision-making structures that excluded newcomers. I contacted Henley, the real estate agent who'd sold us the property. I asked directly whether she'd warned us about community structures, about expectations for new residents, about previous families' experiences. Henley's response was almost sympathetic. She acknowledged that the community had particular character, that some families adjusted well, others didn't. She suggested that we had options, could attempt to integrate, or could choose to relocate. But she emphasized that relocating would come with complications, that property values in the area were potentially subject to market fluctuations, that leaving suddenly might result in financial loss. I understood then that we'd purchased property in a community that operated as a closed system, that operated outside conventional rules, that made decisions about residents collectively and expected participation or exit. I understood that multiple families had been forced into similar situations, that some had been driven out through intimidation and pressure, that others had integrated into what I could only describe as a cult-like community structure. I understood that our physical isolation, the distance from town, the remoteness of our property, meant that external authorities had limited ability or willingness to intervene. We made the decision to leave. We listed the property at a loss. We packed quickly. We moved back to Seattle within weeks. We abandoned significant financial investment. We sacrificed the dream of rural living. But we escaped. I believe we made the right choice. I believe other families were not so fortunate. I believe the community outside Bellingham continues to operate under its own rules, continues to evaluate new residents, continues to offer choices that are fundamentally no choices at all. I don't know what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd attempted to integrate, if we'd decided to participate in whatever community structures and obligations existed. I only know that our protective instincts, once activated, were clear that remaining was not an option, that safety for our children required removing them from that environment immediately. My name is Quincy, and I've been commuting across the Tacoma Narrows Bridge at 3 in the morning for nearly 4 years. I work the graveyard shift at a manufacturing facility in Tacoma, and I live on the opposite side of the bridge in a small community where housing is affordable. I make the crossing 5 nights a week. The drive takes approximately 15 minutes depending on traffic, which at 3 in the morning is minimal. I've developed a routine so automatic that I barely register the drive most nights. Muscle memory and exhaustion guiding me across the span while my mind exists in that space between waking and sleeping. But one night in March, that routine broke in ways that permanently altered my understanding of what's possible on that bridge. I remember the specific night with clarity. It was a Wednesday. Cold, clear skies, no weather complications. I left work around 2:45, stopped at a convenience store for coffee, and began my commute toward the bridge around 3 in the morning. The bridge was nearly empty, just the occasional semi-truck, no other passenger vehicles. I was in my usual semi-conscious state, the route so familiar that my hands steered instinctively, my focus more on the coffee I was drinking than on the actual driving. Then something happened that jolted me into absolute awareness. My car lurched sideways, a movement that shouldn't have been possible on a stable bridge span. The shift was violent enough to slosh my coffee, enough to grab my complete attention. I checked my steering, my tires. Nothing seemed wrong, but the sensation persisted. The bridge beneath my car seemed to be moving in ways that defied physics. My dashboard lit up with activity that shouldn't occur. The windshield wipers activated by themselves, running at full speed despite no rain. The radio switched stations repeatedly, cycling through different frequencies rapidly. The speedometer fluctuated wildly, showing speeds that didn't match my actual velocity. I was gripping my wheel tightly, trying to maintain control, trying to understand what was happening. All my doors were locked. My windows were completely closed. There was no explanation for the dashboard malfunction. The car was perhaps 5 years old, well maintained. I'd had no mechanical issues. Then I saw it. Movement in my peripheral vision. Another vehicle beside me on the nearly empty bridge. The other car was difficult to focus on. Its outline seemed to blur. The windows were dark, impenetrably dark. I couldn't see inside, couldn't determine if there was a driver, but I had the absolute sensation of being watched. The other vehicle appeared to be a sedan, older model, the kind of car that might have been common in the 1970s or 80s, but everything about it seemed slightly wrong, slightly insubstantial, like it wasn't entirely present in the physical world. The car matched my speed exactly. When I accelerated, it accelerated. When I decelerated, it decelerated. We moved in perfect synchronization across the bridge, and I felt terror escalating through my nervous system. I attempted to increase my speed significantly, pressing the accelerator, hoping to break away from this matching vehicle. But the other car kept pace, maintained the exact distance, continued the perfect mirror of my movements. I tried moving to different lanes. The other vehicle followed. I felt like I was being hunted, being toyed with by something that could anticipate my every action. I tried to see inside the other vehicle more clearly, strained my eyes looking toward the driver's side window, and I swear I saw a face, pale and indistinct, just watching me, studying me, with an intensity that felt predatory. Then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, the other vehicle accelerated dramatically and vanished ahead of me on the bridge. I expected to see it disappearing into the distance, but there was nothing. The bridge ahead was completely empty. No vehicle visible, nowhere. The car could have gone in the seconds between its acceleration and my attempt to track it. I was left alone on the bridge. My dashboard activity ceased. My wipers stopped. My radio settled on a single station. My speedometer stabilized. Everything returned to normal. But I was shaking so severely I could barely steer. I pulled off at the first opportunity and sat in my parked car for probably 30 minutes, trying to process what I'd experienced, trying to construct rational explanations. I made it home, but I was profoundly disturbed. I couldn't sleep that day. I kept replaying the incident, trying to understand it. That evening before my next shift, I mentioned the experience to a coworker named Yusra in the break room. I described it casually at first, trying to gauge whether I sounded crazy. Yusra's immediate reaction was shock. She went completely pale. She asked me very specific questions with unusual intensity. She asked if it happened at 3 a.m, if there was another car, if I felt like the bridge was moving. The specificity of her questions told me immediately that she knew something about what I'd experienced. Yusra pulled me aside privately after work. She told me she'd had an identical experience. She'd seen the same inexplicable car, felt the same matching behavior, experienced the same sensation of being hunted or studied. She said it had happened to her multiple times over the years. She'd commuted on the bridge. She said she'd mentioned it to other regular night commuters, and most of them had experiences to share. Similar encounters, similar patterns. There was apparently a network of night commuters who'd experienced this phenomenon, but they didn't talk about it publicly, didn't discuss it openly. There was almost an unspoken agreement to maintain silence. I researched the bridge extensively after that. I found historical records of construction deaths during the bridge's building. I found accounts of the original bridge collapse in 1940. I found historical newspaper articles documenting the recovery efforts, the engineers' reports. I found references in multiple sources to unexplained incidents on the bridge dating back to its opening in 1950. Drivers reporting strange vehicles, temporal anomalies, missing time, vehicles vanishing. There were patterns of reports concentrated around the 3 o'clock hour, patterns that suggested something specific about that time window, something that made the bridge behave differently. I spoke with Tilly, another driver who works in Tacoma, who commutes on the bridge regularly. She confirmed that she'd experienced the phenomenon multiple times. She described it with the same specificity as Yusra: the matching vehicle, the inexplicable behavior, the sensation of being observed. She told me she'd decided years earlier that she couldn't bear to leave the bridge after an encounter, that something seemed to require her to continue crossing, that she'd tried switching jobs to avoid the bridge, and circumstances had always pulled her back. She was trapped in a cycle of commuting, of experiencing, of being unable to escape. I've continued commuting across the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. I've experienced the phenomenon approximately 8 times in the past year. Each experience follows the same pattern. Each one leaves me shaken and unnerved. Each one deepens my conviction that something fundamental about that bridge operates outside normal physical reality. I've discovered through research that other regular commuters have reported similar experiences spanning decades, some dating back to the 1950s, suggesting that whatever is happening on that bridge has been happening continuously since at least the bridge's opening. I don't understand the mechanism. I don't understand why or what. I only know that I return to the bridge every night at approximately 3 a.m, and I don't know if I'm choosing to return or if something is compelling my return. I don't know if I'll ever be free from this cycle. I only know that the bridge waits, and the matching vehicle returns, and I'm caught in an endless pattern that I can't escape. This story featured one primary narrator and references to two female commuters who experienced similar phenomena. All names changed for privacy, but the events described are exactly as they occurred, repeated by multiple witnesses across decades, creating a pattern that defies conventional explanation. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Comment your location and time below. Subscribe to Unspoken Fears for more verified true accounts that will challenge your understanding of reality. And let's explore the mysteries that exist beyond our comprehension together. Thank you for witnessing these stories.